But our last session today is really prime territory for whole education, this notion of wider skills and attributes and the importance of them. And we're 2 minutes away.
Hi, David, I'm back, sorry. David, I think you're muted.
I was just teasing Andy Daly indirectly with him without his presence about the fact what he used to teach a long time ago. You're closer to Andy than I because you live in the same part of the country. Does he still ever teach his original subject?
Well, there's lots of CMAP colleagues on, I think, on as part of the audience at the moment.
I like to live dangerously, Lisa.
Yes, I think they could
it
tell
might
us.
bring Andy back on to start to abuse me too.
I think fortunately for him, he's part of his SLT meeting now. But yeah, I'm sure he still hankers after running around a field, but. I've not
The
seen
CMIC colleagues are smiling. I'm not encouraging anything on the chat, but anyway. But I resisted it when he was on the session.
Yeah. Well,
anyway, how many people have we still got with us? That's before we're about to start. Pete?
We've got 234 at the moment, but numbers are going up slightly.
That's absolutely brilliant. And we really do thank you for staying with us for the morning, because I mean, it's one of the debates we had, wasn't Lisa, about how long should the session be, but we thought we wanted to run a proper conference this time. And no, but really, well, all credit to you. But as I said, any suggestions, thoughts that, you know, how to make it better for you are always welcome. There are limits in the technology, and we, you know, and especially for larger groups. And I hope you found we've been responsive to the chat, and it's certainly given us some thoughts of things we could delve more deeply into too, which is encouraging. And thank you particularly to the team at WholeEd, if I forget to do this at the end, for the efforts in putting this together and the support of GL. I know a lot of work's gone into getting this together and communicating it as we've gone along. Is there a participation certificate available for this webinar? I think there has to be something for people who've stayed to the end. Normally we'd have some extra snacks or healthy snacks, being whole education, you know, wholemeal bagels and the like. It would be very much our territory, wouldn't it, Lisa?
It certainly would be. Can I just also say, and on that note to the sort of certification bit, if you do want to acknowledge that you were on the day, and as you said, David, I don't think whilst we've all been forced into this online world, we're all developing our skills and developing our understanding of what works best. So obviously today again was another trial at sort of the 4 sessions, and we do echo, you know, that thanks. And also this has been completely sort of whole education GL joint collaboration and partnership. So I want to thank all the whole ed colleagues and all the GL colleagues, and urge those that are listening to sort of check out both organisations via the websites, or also you can send us any emails. And on Thursday at 2 o'clock, I know you said this, David, but GL colleagues are going to be joining us again, but for a more intimate, personal, deep dive into any leaders, so head teachers, deputy heads, senior leaders who want to have a little bit more of a deep dive. But I don't want to eat into any more of this.
No, I think we should get started. Fees also, I think we've recorded these in 4 different chunks, so you could use one chunk or part of a chunk with your staff. This I won't say it's the best last, but certainly particularly interesting, and something that we probably put less energy into with any degree of formality. And under the heading of re-engaging students beyond the crisis, and how do we assure students are ready and motivated, but a much wider question that alluded to before the break. So over to Lisa to introduce this session.
Okay, this session is very, very close to my own heart and to my own sort of values centre, and I know it is to whole ed schools, and I also know it is to GL, but getting the attitudes right, getting the right attitudes and behaviours for learning is something that we believe to be very much important. And also when I first joined whole education, my very first meeting was with GL, and this has a purpose. I know that we shared the same sort of mission statement of to measure what you value, not value what you measure, and I think that PASS is at the heart of that. And I'm delighted to introduce on the screen Sam Rayner as well, and Zara, who hopefully we'll be able to see. Zara, if we turn your camera on, that would be fantastic, who are going to be our contributors to this session, who've got a lot to share throughout the suite of GL, but are particular experts in the PASS survey. And I'm handing over now to Hilary to give a sort of summary of some of the research behind it.
So it's always nice to hear that PASS is close to somebody's heart and to what they do, because we at GL also feel it's such a oftentimes undervalued aspect of the student and how they approach their learning. And I just thought I'd make a couple of comments about the time we find ourselves in and how attitudes may have changed, and how at this point in time it may be particularly pertinent to really understand what's going on with the kids as they return to school. So it's been a time of high anxiety, I think, for everybody, and people react in different ways. And I know previously one of our contributors said, like, children are remarkably resilient, and they are, but they will have reacted differently. They will have all had very different lockdown experiences, both personally and in relationship to their learning. And one of the things I've become increasingly concerned about is we know that online learning for adults has a very high dropout rate. It has a very high incidence of motivation starting to dwindle, and people not completing courses that they sign up to do online. We don't really have a lot of research evidence on children as yet, but one can see that the same sorts of patterns might be that might exist with children, and might even be a bit worse in terms of adults are often quite motivated by external factors as well as internal factors, whereas children might not be in the same way. So it's been a prolonged period, and if the learning experience has been demotivating, has that had an impact on their self-confidence of how they'll approach learning when they return to school? I'm going to be very personal. My son the other day was set a task on fractions and came and interrupted a session just like this and went, "I'm really stupid. I really don't understand what's going on." And that made me really upset, because I thought to myself, that's not the level of confidence I want in a child when approaching mathematics. But there are all sorts of reasons why that confidence might be being eroded. And something like PASS will really give insight into where children are when they return to school. Both on an individual level, but I also think on a group level. Their whole, the year group's whole feeling about school, their feelings about their teachers might have changed. They also might be remarkably positive. I've heard from some of the teachers we speak to at GL that they're saying, "Oh, our children just can't wait to get back to school. They can't wait to be back in the environment where they see their teachers face to face." And that will be true too. So I think I echo Lisa's, like, this is something I'm really passionate about. It's something that I think really provides you with that holistic view of where a child is in terms of their learning.
Thank you, Hilary. That's tremendous. It's going now to go to school and Zara. Shenley Brook End is a place we often run some of our training sessions in their wonderful learning and teaching centre, but also a school that's been absolutely committed to the notion of a whole education and looking closely at wider skills and attributes. So, Zara.
Hi there. Yeah, so the PASS survey has become integral to what we do at Shenley Brook End. But just to echo what was being said earlier, we started really small. I think it was in 2016, actually, David. I sat and listened to you talking about measuring what we value and talking about measuring the whole child. And I sat and I thought, we have our parent groups, we do our very small scale student surveys, maybe with a pilot group, but do we know how all students feel about school? And the answer was no. As a school, to give you some context, we're a very large, comprehensive, and we grew very quickly over a 3-year period. So maybe some of those previous systems that have worked about everyone knowing somebody, we used the spirals of inquiry saying, does every child have 3 people that they feel they could go to? And we found ourselves over a 3-year period finding that the answer was no. We didn't feel all children had that person. So we felt we needed to listen to student voice more wildly. The PASS survey is an online survey of 50 questions that students rank. It takes about 20 minutes for them to do, and at the end of it you get all manner of data. The brilliant thing about that data is the levels on which it features. We were talking earlier about data for the right people. So when you do the PASS survey, you get a student by student analysis of how they have ranked those 50 questions in terms of really agree or disagree. You also get a whole year group, but you get the whole school as well. So you can really disseminate that information. You can give the student view to form tutors and year leaders. You can give the year view to progress leaders. You can, as an SLT, look at patterns over time. Like I say, we're quite lucky now because we've got data going back from 2016, so we can see how over time year 10's views and attitudes have changed maybe. We had a really stark moment with PASS when we had a year where only 2 questions came back red. As always in ragging, red is not good with the PASS survey. And our 2 questions that came back as red were, my teacher notices when I have worked hard, and my teacher tells me when I have done something well. And we sat and looked at that, and it became very clear very quickly that those 2 questions are about praise. And actually, as a school, we weren't praising enough. And those 2 questions fed into the same issue, and that allowed us to then go on and to look at how we were praising, building a reward system that was valued by our students. I think the best thing about PASS is it's data that asks questions, not gives answers. You look at the data and the dialogue it creates, and you tend to get quite high buy-in from staff because it's very real. You can see by student. One of our key questions linking PASS to this context that we're going to be very interested in when we come back in September is, there is a question on the PASS survey that says, do you feel safe in school? Now, up to that point, up to this point so far, if that ever came up as red for a student, we've been, oh, that must be a safeguarding issue. There's been a follow-up conversation. There's very few students you would expect to put that. But actually, as we move into these uncertain times, I think we'll see an increase in that, and we might be able to use it in some way to see if our measures that we're putting in place are good enough for our students in school, and our communication is good enough in making them feel safe. It's interesting that we said this was last because it links into so much we've said. We've talked previously in these sessions about triangulation, and we've worked really hard as a school to make sure that PASS is part of our triangulation of data. We kind of have this Go for School spreadsheet, whatever systems you use, that has got the data you'd normally expect, whether it be Key Stage 2 data, whether it be current assessment data, but we've actually put the past data alongside that on a spreadsheet, because the links aren't always as you'd expect. Someone said to me, well, what's the point in PASS if students have low attitudes and low self-esteem? You'll be able to see that because they won't be at their work and at grade. It's not always the case, and we use PASS to talk about our ghost students or our lost students, whatever terminology you prefer, but it tends to be that the brightest shout the loudest sometimes, and those that are struggling you can see, but we have this big band of students in the middle that we don't want to be faceless people in school. In terms of the validity of PASS data, we found it to be really strong as well. It tends to be, when you look at it year on year, that you can see certain year groups over time and track changes, because it is, we've talked about standardization before, it is that standardized test. It just gives us the best of questions. We had a question at the beginning of this year about why do our year 9 girls not like social time, and we went and had a whole conversation with that about some of our year 9 girls, because it came back, there's a question on the survey about do you feel you behave at social time, and our year 9 girls were like, no we don't. So we were having that conversation about why that might be. The other thing about PASS is, because it is an online survey, students get an individualised code. We're hoping in September, whether we have all students back in the building or not, we will be able to do that survey, even if it's in a distance way of emailing them their login and say, can you do that? Because we're really eager to get all students' view when we come back, and actually maybe those students who aren't coming back in the building because of parental choice or because of fear, that could really open the dialogue, having the responses to that survey. And one last thing, we talk about PASS in school being our signpost. Quite often we get responses to the PASS data, and we use it as our signpost to things. So there's questions around confidence in learning, there's questions around capability. And if we can see a student that's got a particular issue, we can use PASS and say, okay, you need to talk to a pastoral leader, you need to talk to a progress leader, you need to talk to somebody in attendance. And PASS has become basically our signpost of going to have the most important conversations in school. And because of those years of doing it, hopefully we've got that repetition and benchmark.
Thank you, Zara. I mean, I think the power that it comes through is the notion that you use it at a collective level, but also at an individual level. And I mean, as a head, I always used to get cross when people talked about a bad year, because it could be inevitably a small number of students that were leading to that judgment. And often a viewed bad year isn't a bad year when you look at PASS. But also it can highlight what's a dominant culture in a particular year. That girls example used about social time can be sometimes a small number of individuals who create a dominant culture. Or you can have a view of a bad year where in fact actually it is a relatively small number in the year that have those views. I mean, have you noticed any trends or any changes over time, Zara?
Yeah, we have, and it's not always just by year group. The PASS survey splits people by micro populations. So we look at it by ethnic minority, we look at it by EAL students. We had a trend a couple of years back that our EAL students were given really quite negative responses, I think, compared to their counterparts. And we thought, well, is that an access issue to the actual survey? But no, when you went to have those conversations with students, they were struggling, and that's helped us build in greater support in school. It's really interesting because we tend to put quite a lot of emphasis on school of parental surveys, whereas actually the ones in the building living and breathing the curriculum and the experience are our students. It will be really interesting going forward. I mean, it's starting to feel like quite inner city school as Milton Keynes expands beyond belief. But I do feel it'll be interesting to look at maybe the ethnic minority group within school going forward, particularly students in response to what's in the media at the moment, possibly, whether those feelings are filtering into school. But yeah, PASS is a really, really good way of spotting those trends. And it doesn't always tell you what you expect, which I think is the power of PASS.
Yeah, when you said that, and I think I think we'd lie to ourselves. We said in a large secondary school or even a medium one that you really know every individual, and it helps you respond to individuals more. I've often felt for the equivalents of heads of year and the like, where in reality, when you look at their week, they actually talk individually to a relatively small number of students, and they talk to them most, and you probably guess who they are. The unnoticed students are particularly good. I mean, the most solitary things I've ever done is go on a pupil pursuit for a day and notice the children who nobody speaks to apart from calling the register out in the course of a day. But it does highlight the groups and how they think. So thank you for that, Zara. Sam, Lisa's described to you as a PASS guru. But I mean, this power of tutoring and relationships to support academic progress, and also Zara mentioned Spirals. Spirals is a project, for those of you who don't know it, that we have the privilege of offering. It was created by some colleagues in Canada, and one of their mantras is, one of the questions they ask students is, are there 3 adults that you could identify that you could talk to and know you really well? And it's actually quite a simple notion. In a large staff, a large school, you could easily have that, but the reality is often that it isn't the case. So that notion of starting with the student and working outwards, I know is part of what you've done too. So Sam, welcome, and I look forward to hearing what you say.
Okay, I'm just going to share my screen with you. Let me just get this working. Okay, so just to get started then, I think it'd be useful to give you a bit of background on the school. So Ely College has had quite a journey, really. We started with CMAT 4 years ago, and at that point the school was in special measures. Things were not going well. We'd been in it for some time and things weren't improving. Lots of changes, different leadership more than once. So really difficult, excuse me, history. And at the point now, exactly this week, actually a year ago, we got our Ofsted that said we were good with outstanding. So it's been quite a journey. We're very much a growing school. And for the first time actually this year, we've now got a waiting list, which is something we've never had before, which has been interesting. So just give you a bit of context before I start showing you this. So I think what's quite useful about PASS is to actually go through this with you so you can see this. So what you've got on the screen there is our results as a school from March 2018. So when the students complete the questions, they get 50 questions in total, and a number of them are quite like statements actually. You're able to drill down to each individual question and see what the response is like as well. So you can really get into some real detail, not just on individuals, but also in particular specific questions. So we came out quite low, as you can see in that first column that's amber with that red area for feelings about school. And obviously we've got other ambers dotted around. Green and onwards is considered to be good and above what you'd expect, so we're happy with them. But it gave us something to focus on in terms of what we needed to do. It wasn't in itself a particular surprise given the history of the school, and we've got that one area that was red with year 8. You can then fast forward and have a look at a year later, and we've been able to make some changes, and that's been really interesting to see that difference and follow the year groups through. So very little now that's red, that's amber, no red at all. And we can track the year groups through. So that red that was in year 8 is now year 9 and the one below. And that's still, although it's green now, it's still the year group that perhaps is the least happy about school. Some of the statements we zoomed in on that stood out for us were really low responses in "this school is a friendly place" and "I think this is a good school." They were all reds or ambers in all year groups in 2018, and then in 2019 they were all green. So it gave us something to really see where we were making improvements in things that are much harder to track in the traditional way. So how have we used it? We've taken it and taken the survey annually in March. So quite frustratingly, actually, we were literally just about to do that survey the week we went into lockdown, which is a bit of a shame. So we haven't actually got this year's to look at. We've considered whether we try and run the survey whilst on lockdown, and we looked through all the questions, but we don't think at this point it's going to work for us. I think it's something we will look to do next March when we return and things have settled. The results of it are shared with tutors and teachers. We did a whole staff CPD and took everybody through how to understand it, so they knew what they were looking at. They could see their tutor group, they could see their teaching groups, and allowed them to start to unpick what that meant for them as tutors and teachers. In CMAT, we run academic mentoring conversations, so we have a vertical tutoring system, and each time a data drop happens for a year group, a tutor will have perhaps 4 students in that year group in their tutor group. They will meet with them for 15 minutes and they'll talk about how their progress is in their subjects. PASS allowed those conversations to start to go into other areas with a bit more confidence, where students were struggling with things, whether they didn't feel they had the confidence in their own learning or abilities, where they perhaps didn't like school, some of the early indicators around attitudes to attendance. All these things could be brought up and discussed. We didn't give students the results of any of the surveys. We very deliberately didn't pull up that information, show them it. We don't want to skew their responses when they take it again. And we haven't shared it with parents either. So it's very much been kept for our benefit to supporting them. It's allowed us to group students and start to think about how we can target them for particular support or intervention. Under that data that we had there with the year 8s in red, we actually underneath all of that was a core group of free school meal girls who were very, very unhappy about school. So grouping them together and actually being able to provide sort of pastoral support, targeted interventions for them was really helpful. Also on a micro level, the tutors have been able to intervene and support individuals, and teachers have been able to group students who perhaps have a high work ethic but aren't seeing the curriculum as being of value to them. That's allowed a bit of careers intervention. It's been used in so many different ways within the school and supported so many different areas of it. It's allowed us to do some comparison. I was particularly, I found when we got the first results in 2018, that actually it didn't tell me enough, because I didn't know how easy it was to change things or not, whether that was normal for our school or not. And as we're getting more information over time, it allows you to then look at sort of trends and comparisons. Are things going up? Are things going down? You can start to get a feel for what's going on. And one of the subgroups that we looked at was actually by primary school. I was quite interested to see whether the primary school the students had come from made any difference to their beliefs in their own learning and abilities in education, because obviously that's something we weren't able to influence but may have had an impact. and that was quite interesting. It did tell us there was some quite big differences between a lot of our feeder primaries, which again allowed us to perhaps work a little bit closer with those students coming from those primaries and look at how we work with the transition from those primary schools. It helps with evidence, we don't want to always think about Ofsted, but we did put it in front of them. It did have it was a part in our journey and showing the evidence of the impact of all the different things we'd put in place and tried to improve in the school. And we run the Spirals of Inquiry project like Zara in our school, and it actually allowed us to highlight particular groups of students we wanted to work with as part of Spirals of Inquiry projects. So the year 9 free school meal girls example is one, but we picked out others as well. Ones that had, attitudes to attendance were quite poor, even though they were there. Ones that didn't see the curriculum of value to them. There was opportunities within that to allow us to then research them as a group and look for strategies to help them. In terms of what I think of strengths and challenges, really, I think it does give you that way of measuring feelings and culture, allows you to see things that aren't always visible. I think it's that classic thing of, a child in front of you is growing a little bit every day and you don't notice it, but when you haven't seen them for 3 months, it's really obvious. I think it's hard to see that when you're in it. So it gives you a way of measuring that change that's happening that you can't do in any other way. It helps you identify the impact. So where you're putting things in place, can you see it's making any changes? It definitely for us shines a light on hidden problems or hidden student groups that we wouldn't have necessarily picked out. It allowed us to group students together that weren't on the surface the same or had anything in common. Some of my challenges or questions around it that I'm still grappling with, I think, feelings are often quite transient. I still wonder how much the day, the time, the weather, what they had the period before they took the test, all those sorts of things. I wonder how much that affects it or is changeable within it. And I think time will tell as we get more of that information. And I'd quite like to get the primary schools, our feeder primaries as well, to try and do this test earlier so we can see how much you can change and influence and what perhaps is more difficult to influence in school. So that bit about how temporary and how permanent is that bit. And I think actually it'd be really interesting to see what the next one we take is, to see what that impact has been of school closure. I think we might find some that are now more positive about school and some that are perhaps less so, and actually within their learning as well and themselves.
Thank you, Zara. That's absolutely tremendous. I like the depth of your thinking on it and how it's led to such quality interventions. An interesting debate to be had about whether you share or don't share the purpose. I think that's quite an interesting one to pick up at the questions at the end. But I also one of the comments on the chat was, don't just look at the reds. I think one of our tendencies is to look at the worst in anything. But I think one of the things, Pat, and I think you've alluded to it, PASS does, is help you look at the less noticed students. And I love this area that you talked about on groupings and grouping. We always, there was a debate earlier on this morning about whether grouping should, as by ability should happen. But groupings of students for these sort of reasons are really interesting, whether it's within a class as well as in other ways. So lots there to take up on questions and look forward to that. Dan, I assume you're going to come in. I know you're a great fan of PASS from GL, and I want you to tell us a little bit more about it. It's a remarkably simple test, but the people who designed it, Dan, obviously knew what they're doing. I think they were psychologists, weren't they, who designed it in the first place?
Absolutely, and I think, yeah, as Hilary mentioned, I think everyone at GL are so passionate about this assessment because I think it tells you something very different from, perhaps a student's potential, their attainment. It helps unlock some of those barriers to learning, and I think that's what's so powerful about the assessment. But I think, as was mentioned in the comments, I think it's a really good point. I think it asks questions and it gives you insights into the data, but I think it's how you impact on those data, how that's shared across teams, how that's shared with form tutors, right across different leaders across the school to have the maximum impact with PASS. And I think it is clear from the lockdown, I think students' attitudes to learning will have been influenced by this period. I think that the challenge is probably, to what extent, and I think that's difficult to determine what that impact has been on them and their well-being, how they're feeling about returning to school, and actually are they in the right headspace to return to learning, and what does that look like for them. I was interested. Adam Bodison, CEO of Nason, recently said, in order to provide effective nurture for children and to support their readiness to learn, it will be important to understand their attitudes and mindset as they return to school. And I think this is what PASS tries to do. So our attitudinal survey will really help to understand which pupils are concerned about being back at school, especially at the return to school now. Pinpoint pupils who are ready to learn and who aren't ready to learn. So again, looking at both the red, the amber, but also the students that are green, which should be celebrated as well. And it provides reports at a whole school, cohort and year group analysis, as well as individual pupil trends. So it gives you a really wealth of analysis to support. In terms of the kind of core factors it covers, these are the 9 core factors PASS covers. I guess they can be grouped into 3 sort of ways, which kind of helps look at PASS. First of all, it's a student's self-perception of their academic competence. So in particular, this looking at their self-regard, how they view themselves as a learner, their self-esteem, looking at their learning capability. So actually what their feelings are about their ability and academic success, which I think is a really important one for us to consider on return to school. And then also thinking about confidence in learning as well. So actually how stickability, how confident are they on returning to school? How confident have they been in engaging with remote learning as well? The other 2 areas are looking at their motivation. So actually any gaps in motivation. So in particular, that's thinking about their response to the curriculum. And then it's also thinking about preparedness for learning as well, which I think is really important to understand that mindset. Are they in the right place for learning? And then finally, it's more contextual factors. So things like their attitudes to teacher, general work ethic, how they feel about attendance and feelings about school, which will be impacted possibly by home, their feelings at home of school. So much more context around their attitudes as well. What PASS will provide you is a few different levels of analysis, as Sam and Zara have used so effectively in their schools. At the first point, it gives you a whole year group or whole school analysis of attitudes, which enables you to look at if there are any kind of key pastoral priorities right across the school that are coming out from the data. I think the next one is identifying key groups, so being able to look at areas such as disadvantaged, gender, free school meals, being able to actually look at what is that data telling you about that group? Are there any significant differences which you would expect to see or might not want to see? It helps back up the judgments of your staff around these students. And then I think the point which Sarah and Sam spent a lot of time on around the individual profiles and actually really being able to understand how a child and how a student feels about these different areas. And it's important not just to focus on the reds, as everyone said. I think it's looking at all different students and actually how does this support your view of that student? Are there some fragile learners in there? Are there vulnerable students that you might not have understood, or actually are they stronger than you thought as well? So hopefully it helps add extra value to your judgments. And then finally, we do provide 50 teaching and learning implications and interventions as well, which are all evidence-based. And these will help support you once you've identified key groups and students. These are all free to access and hopefully just a really useful bank of materials to support your staff as well.
Thanks, Dan.
There are a couple of questions and wary of time, sorry, but a few people did just want to see some examples of what a PASS question looked like. So just wanted to put this up for everyone, just so they can understand what the type of questions you would get asked in a PASS survey are. Only takes 20 minutes and standardized on over 600,000 students to get a really good feel around this. David, I'll leave that there.
Yeah, thank you, Dan. He leaves us with that. Yeah. And I mean, it's the standardization and the scale, isn't it, Dan, that you test these against. I mean, it gives you a degree of trust and validity, which you probably can't get almost anywhere else, because you can have a hunch as a teacher, but this can validate the hunch. And if it doesn't match your hunch, it gives you something to investigate. I'm going to try a hunch on you, Dan. I wonder if, and Hilary as well possibly, is if when students go back to school, they will have a set of attitudes. They may be quite different in 3 months' time. It would be really interesting, perhaps, to do it more than once a year in this time. I don't know what your thoughts of either of you on that are.
Absolutely. I think there's been quite a few schools we've been talking to already, actually, that have wanted to look at using pass right at the, early on in September, and then redoing it again sort of December, January, which will really tell you kind of have some of those attitudes changed over that 3-4 month window. It's a quick 20-minute assessment, so it's not going to take a huge amount of time to administer, but it could tell you some really useful attitudinal changes and shifts within that 4 months, which I agree, I think is a really interesting area to understand the impact of lockdown.
And I think some of the work we've done with you, I'll come back to Hilary, sorry. Some of the work we've done with you is you can actually identify intervention groups as well as a group within PASS.
Yeah.
Hilary, did you want to come in?
I was just going to add that there are schools even prior to this time who do use it more than once a year, and often it's really interesting. So we had we've had schools who've used it sort of at the beginning of year 7 and then 6 months in, and they've actually identified that once they stop their transition efforts, actually the attitudes of their year 7s drop. So they come in really keen to learn at the beginning, and then actually 3-4 months in they're slightly demotivated by secondary school, and that's allowed them to ask the questions why. Your point, David, about it allows you to ask the questions why. And I wanted to say a little bit more about also the green bits, and not only looking at the red, because I've been very luckily part of a conversation in a school which was around what is it we're actually doing that those things are green. Because we should carry on doing those things. We're not actually sure what they are. And actually they got a bit of student voice then and got the kids involved and said, overall, you're really positive about this. Why is that? What is it the school does that makes you really positive about these things? Because we don't want to stop doing those things and then find out that, we're slipping up.
I'm really glad you highlighted that, Hilary, because I think there's something in our psyche. Maybe it's an English thing, or maybe it's just the nature of any leader. You immediately run your finger down and look for what's wrong.
Yeah.
And the other bit, it goes back to what we were saying at the beginning of that combination of good standardized data and teacher assessment, is that if you get a hunch like a green, that's a really good thing to talk to individual students about why. I mean, it's that combination.
Just if I can, if I can add to that, because we keep talking about staff workload at the moment as well, and I think there's also a culture in schools that if we try something and we don't know if it works or not, we carry on doing it, and then we add exponential things and we just add more and more and more, and it does give you that opportunity to remove something, and actually if the ratings don't go down and the student feedback is still positive, then that's something that maybe didn't have to happen. And I think we're always very nervous as leaders to stop doing something, but that has to happen for new priorities to make way, and this can help with that.
Oh, sorry, I'm so pleased you said that. Anybody who's had to suffer me on a course knows at some point you get me talking about abandonment, what you stop doing. And this notion that we keep, I think there's two things here. One is that the notion is we keep adding to what you do already. I think the current circumstance and going back to school should give us a chance to look at what we stop doing. But programs like this can say, I mean, we know increasingly interventions that make a difference. And in some ways it's our own judgment, because almost any intervention will work if you put enough effort into it. But some interventions are more effective than others. Some are more suited to the ethos of the school and all the rest of it. And I think one of the things I think you're also alluding to is interventions that really punch above their weight, or particular groups of students they respond to. I mean, one of my observations is the least worst. I don't like to add anything to that, Zara.
Yeah, no, it's that idea, isn't it? I mean, I know the EEF use this idea of money and time and whether something is effective in terms of those two things. It's just about knowing what works with whom as well. I think if we do something with year 7 and it works, we then get overexcited and do something with the exact same thing with year 8, 9 and 10, and actually they might not be in that place. PASS is really good for those transition points. So finding out what's helpful the year 7s coming in, or whether it's year 8 or 9 picking their options, it allows you to see that by cohort analysis. And I think sometimes we think because something works with one group, we should do it for everyone because we're scared someone's missing out, but we have to have lots of things in our toolkit that we kind of deploy to different people.
I need to give a shout out for Kenny, who's made lots of comments in the chat this morning, and I particularly like this last one, where he said he talks about why do I need a teacher when I've got Google as a publication to look at, So thanks for that, Kenny. I think it's one we should perhaps circulate a link to. Dan, I know we did that. You've got some superb case studies of use of PAT as well that would be worth re-highlighting. I know there were slightly older publications in some cases, but I think that would be worth doing if you could. Sam, do you want to add
I noticed there were some questions around how it links with pupil premium strategies as well. So yeah, we can link in a few past case study links on the follow-up email after this session.
I mean, it was a great, I mean, a natural intervention group of pupil premium students. Sam, is there anything you'd like to add from the questions? I've noticed you've been responding to a number. Can you unmute?
Yeah, sorry, just spotted that. Yeah, there's one question that's in the question thing around how it's being used in terms of SEND and SENCO. I think that one particularly was quite interesting for us because when our first survey was done, when the school wasn't in such a great place, actually one of our happiest groups with attitudes to teachers and their learning was actually a lot of our SEND students. And that wasn't necessarily something we particularly expected to find. And we kind of looked at it backwards. We then started trying to work out, a bit like what you were saying, Hilary, about trying to work out what is it we've done that's caused that. And we actually think it was that relationship with teaching assistants where they've had that support as they've been going around that perhaps has given them that security. So it's interesting. Our SENCO has taken it and is using it herself in various ways, but it does show things that you don't expect, and it makes you look at it, go backwards as well and say, well, what did we do? What was it? Which is actually quite helpful as well.
Yeah, okay, just both of you. You know that famous question in Spirals about who is the most significant adult or person who thinks knows you best in your school. What did you find out in your school was the answer to that question?
For me personally, in our school, for most students, it's actually their tutor, which is the relationship we wanted to build. And because that tutor has that extra information, you know, that's led to, I think, the students believing their tutor knows them very well, and they do because they have that. And I think for a lot of the SEND students, they did bring up TAs and the support,
TAs,
which we would expect actually. But yeah, typically it was tutor.
And Zara, did you get and when you did Spirals, what did you find was the answer to that out of interest?
Honestly, no pattern. It was really random. If it was form tutor for a lot, but actually if you're one of our students who struggles in school, then like you say, year leaders tend to have that great relationship. For a school refuser, it's the attendance officer who rings their home and cares that they're not in. For the musician, it's the music teacher. We had no pattern, and we were okay with that actually. We just decided that everyone needed somebody. That's harder to monitor. But yeah.
I'm with you, Zara, on everybody needing somebody, but it needs. It's like we talked earlier on this morning about structures and having a structured response, because part of me would like students to be able to identify their his, because the only downside of a tutor is it's sort of the tutor's forced on you and you don't have a choice, and it might not be the right person for you. Anyway, that's a sort of aside, but we should, Alex, put out the details of Spirals so people, we've talked about it a lot, and for those who are on the course this morning may not know about it, so we can put out something about it. I think we're about 3 or 4 minutes from the end, and I'm determined that we finish exactly on time. Can I thank Zara and Sam for contributing? And Sam, I know you've been on since the beginning. I hope it didn't feel a long time. Thanks. Also,
very interesting.
Yeah, thank you. Our colleagues from GL, I mean, for the insights. I always like any organisation that's underpinned by research and thinking and an evidence base, which is simply remarkable. But to come back to the beginning, it's the combination of views. I talked about being data informed at the beginning. It's how we use it. And I think to me, that's the strongest part. Any closing words from each of you? Hilary, anything you want to say?
I just wanted to thank you for chairing this, David, and for all the panelists and for the attendees for a really interesting discussion. And to just say that we hear if and when, because we've had lots of discussions about when and how we can best help. And I think we're here whenever schools decide they are what we have is at the time for them to use it when we can help.
Thank you, Hilary. Dan? And thank you for your support today, by the way.
Absolutely. I want to extend a big thank you to you, David, and to Lisa for all the work that Whole Education have done. We're delighted to work in partnership. And Sam, Zara, as well as Tim and Andy before that, just to hear those insights, I think it's absolutely fantastic to see how that data is used so effectively. So from GL, a massive thank you to everyone who's attended and everyone who's contributed and raised some fantastic questions, which we will endeavour to get back to everyone on as well.
And then the earlier comments about you as attendees, I mean, those who've stuck with us this morning, thank you. I mean, we didn't know what to hope. We knew a lot of people had signed up, but the fact the majority have stayed with us through the session is very edifying, and I think gives us good food for thought. And definitely the Lisa point, if it's useful for you for your portfolios and things to have an attendance certificate. One thing I'd like to say as a closing thing, just to spend a moment of reflection, and do fill the chat with these if you feel willing. What's the most significant thing you have taken away from this morning? There's more than one, but try and ration it down to one or two. Fill the chat with it as we close, and we'll leave the chat open for a few minutes for that, or use the tweet at WE small in capitals then assessment. But what the most significant thing, just spend a moment as Lisa's summing up and saying goodbye. What's the most significant thing you personally take away, or something you hope to go and do in the light of this? And use the chat, and it will be a very helpful thing to have, and it will also inform what we can do. And if you want to go on from that, anything you think we could do to take you further personally in this work. It's been my pleasure to be with you. I find it a fascinating morning, and I want to hand over to Lisa to close the conference and for some closing words.
Thank you ever so much, David. And it only remains for me to say a huge thank you to you for facilitating this morning. There's lots of positive comments coming through on the chat. I want to again reiterate a huge thank you to our school colleagues. We know you are at your busiest at the moment. We know how busy schools are and how much work you're doing 24/7. So a special thank you to Tim and to Andy and to Sam and to Zara. Huge thank you to our GL colleagues, and we really do want to say that we, working in partnership with GL, it's such a privilege to have you as partners, and we really do feel that schools and young people benefit from what you are providing for schools and leaders. There was one question about whether or not groups of schools can benefit from using GL products, and I can say that the whole education has seen that, and if you wanted to speak to people like the Blackpool group, the Bolton group, or any of our multi-academy trusts on working, that would be brilliant. As always, we welcome any inquiries into whole education. We are first and foremost a network, for teachers, with leaders, and it's been a real privilege to spend the last 4 hours with you. So thank you to everybody. Special thanks to David, and I look forward to sort of connecting with you all in the future. So thank you, everybody.
Loving the comments that are coming through are things you're going to do and take away.